Okay, welcome to this week's episode of A Curious Mind, where we explain complicated concepts in plain English. So this week we're actually going to talk about the history of the cell and what exactly a cell is and where it comes from, who discovered it, and some of the differences between the cells. So the cell was first noted and discovered by this guy Robert Hooke. He was commissioned by the king to study insects basically, and he was just throwing things underneath his microscope. And so in 1922 he actually used this microscope and sliced a little piece of cork, just like from a wine bottle, and put it on a slide and looked at it, and he saw this image where you can see along these white lines here is this lattice-like structure. And so he looked at that and studied it a bit, and thought that basically when he published his book 3 years later, he thought that they looked like little monk cells in a monastery, and so he called each of those individual rooms a cell. He actually tried to count them all and estimated there'd be about 1.2 trillion cells per square inch. So they're very, very tiny things. But 1965 is when we first saw the mention of the cell by this Bobby Hooke. So he and his friends got together and they came up several years later with this theory called the cell theory, about how cells are formed and where they come from, what makes a cell a cell. So by definition, all living things must be made of cells. So anything that is dead, like a plastic bottle or something like that, is not going to be made of cells. That's made of different material. Anything alive, whether it be a tree or a bacteria or a human being, is going to be made of cells. The second aspect of the cell theory is that the cell has to be the basic unit of structure of that organism. So there are one-celled organisms. Humans are multi-billion-celled organisms. But if you keep splitting it apart, you'll end up with these individual cells. It's basically an extension of part one. Now, interesting little side note is that, I don't know if any of you are cooks, but you know that if you're making a salad, you rip the lettuce or you rip any of the greens. And that's because it divides the lettuce along those cell walls, so you don't get that browning at the edge. Versus if you cut them, you actually cut through those cell walls, and the stuff inside the cells leaks out and gets exposed to air and becomes brown. We can talk about that in more detail in another episode. But it is a little link as to what cell walls are and their function. The third part of the cell theory is that all cells must come from pre-existing cells. Now that begs the question, where did the first cell come from? Which is also another question for another episode. There is much ongoing debate about that within the scientific community and between the scientific and religious communities. So we're not even going to get into that. But currently, in today's world, all cells come from pre-existing cells. So they have a parent cell that then divides into two identical cells. And we will talk again in more detail about how that happens and how they can replicate like that. You'll notice that this has no mention of DNA. This is obviously before DNA was even thought of. That has since been added in to the cell theory. But back when cells were first discovered, nobody had any idea about what DNA or RNA was. So they didn't include that in their initial thing. Be like Ben Franklin writing about the internet and the Declaration of Independence. Just not even a consideration. So now there are two different main types of cells. There are prokaryotes, which are known to be kind of the older version of a cell. They're very much more simplistic, which is maybe a bad word to use, but you can see this nucleoid matter in the cell, and the prokaryotic cell on the left has nothing binding it in, and so it's literally just floating around in the cytoplasm. It's very exposed to injury or mutation. The next kind of evolution of those cells was the eukaryotic cell, which is, you can see this nucleus there in the purple on the right side of the cell is bound by a membrane. It's all protected. There's other organelles in there. The Golgi is labeled, the plasma membrane itself, the mitochondria, that are all membrane-bound organelles. And that is the only key difference that you need to know for these is that prokaryotes and eukaryotes differ in that eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. So that's the primary difference. Now, within the eukaryotic community, we can see that original picture again with the cell walls. And within the eukaryotic community, there are plant cells and animal cells. And so this is a sample of cork, and you can see those white cell walls, which lets us know that this is a plant cell. Now these are dead, so all of the internal structures are gone, but that rigid cell wall is still standing. And you can see here in this image, all that green, outside green, is a thick cell wall. It's very rigid, very structured. It's like a brick almost. That's why when you knock on a tree, it's hard and stiff, versus when you push on your own skin, it's a little more squishy. And that's because animal cells don't have that cell wall. This is an animal cell here on the right, and they're almost more like a beanbag. And the fact that they do have some structure, but it's much more malleable and much more squishy. There are some other differences involved here, a lot of similarities, because they're both eukaryotic cells, but plants have a larger vacuole size, and the cell wall. We'll talk in much more detail about the differences between those, and we'll get into what all those organelles are and what they do. We'll do that actually in the next episode, but just wanted to give you an introduction of a cell and the history of cells and where they come from and how we know about them. So thanks for watching, and tune into the next episode.